The drive from the orphanage to Jane's temporary residence felt like an eternity. The snow had picked up, flurrying against the windshield in a dizzying dance that made it difficult to see the road ahead. Jane's grip on the steering wheel was tight, her knuckles white, as she kept glancing at Sister Agnes, who sat silently in the passenger seat. Sister Agnes hadn't said a word since they had fled the orphanage. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if in prayer. Jane had a million questions swirling in her mind, but she knew that now wasn't the time. They needed to get to safety first. Finally, they reached the small motel where Jane had been staying. The parking lot was nearly empty, the building's faded sign barely visible through the falling snow. Jane parked the car near the entrance, and the two women hurried inside, eager to escape the cold. Once they were in the relative warmth of Jane's motel room, she locked the door behind them and turned to Sister Agnes. The older woman's face was pale, her eyes still wide with the residual fear of their escape. "Sister Agnes," Jane began, keeping her voice calm and gentle, "I know you're frightened, but I need your help. You know something about the children that Mr. Roberts adopted, don't you?" Sister Agnes hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I never wanted to be involved in this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But when Mr. Roberts started bringing those children to the orphanage, I knew something was wrong. He was always so secretive, so controlling." Jane nodded, encouraging her to continue. "What did you find out?" Sister Agnes took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. "He was obsessed with finding the perfect child. He believed that one of the orphans held the key to something greater, something unnatural. I didn't understand it fully, but he talked about unlocking potential, about making the perfect heir." The words sent a chill down Jane's spine. She had seen the experiments in the hidden room at the mansion, but hearing about them from someone who had witnessed Mr. Roberts' obsession firsthand made it all the more real and horrifying. "What happened to the children?" Jane asked, her voice tense. Sister Agnes looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "They were discarded. When they didn't meet his expectations, he got rid of them. I don't know how or where, but I know that one child, one special child, survived. He called that child the heir." Jane's mind raced. "Do you know where this child is?" Sister Agnes shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't. After the last child disappeared, I tried to keep my distance, to stay out of it, but I know that child was the key to everything, and I know that Mrs. Whelan has been searching for them ever since." Jane sat back, absorbing the weight of Sister Agnes's words. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about exposing Mr. Roberts' crimes. It was about finding a child who had been the victim of those crimes and who might still be in danger. Before Jane could ask anything else, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the caller ID, unknown number. With a quick glance at Sister Agnes, she answered. "Miss Donovan," the familiar gravelly voice said, "I hear you've been busy." It was the man from the train station. Jane felt a mix of relief and wariness. "I need more information," she said, cutting straight to the point. "You said Sister Agnes was the key, but she doesn't know where the child is. What else do you know?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "Meet me tonight, same place. There's more you need to hear." The line went dead before Jane could respond. She lowered the phone, her thoughts spinning. The man had more to tell her, but could she trust him? And was it worth the risk of another meeting? She looked at Sister Agnes, who seemed even more fragile now, and knew that she didn't have a choice. If there was any chance of finding the heir and exposing the truth, she had to take it. Night had fallen by the time Jane reached the old train station once again. The snow had stopped, leaving the world blanketed in a thick, undisturbed layer of white. The station looked even more desolate under the pale moonlight, its shadows long and deep, as if the building itself was trying to swallow any hint of life that approached. Jane parked her car in the same spot as before, her breath misting in the cold night air as she stepped out. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of her boots in the snow. She kept her eyes and ears sharp, scanning for any sign of movement, but the station appeared empty. She had just reached the entrance when she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Jane's heart skipped a beat, and she spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for the small can of pepper spray she had tucked into her pocket. But it was the man from before, his breath visible in the frigid air as he approached. He stopped a few feet away, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Easy, Miss Donovan, I'm here to help." Jane slowly lowered her hand, but she didn't fully relax. "What do you have for me?" The man's expression was grim. "I've been trying to find out more about the heir, where the child might be, but there's something you need to know. Mrs. Whelan isn't the only one looking for them. There's someone else, someone with a lot of power and resources, who has been searching for the heir ever since Mr. Roberts died." Jane felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. "Who and why?" The man glanced around, as if ensuring they were truly alone. "I don't know their identity, but I've heard whispers that they're connected to a larger organization, something beyond just Mr. Roberts and his experiments. They believe that the heir holds the key to something valuable, something that could change everything." Jane's mind raced with the implications. A powerful organization. What could the heir possibly have that would make them the target of such intense interest? "What do they want with the heir?" she asked, her voice low. The man shook his head. "I don't know for sure, but whatever it is, it's dangerous. They've been covering their tracks, erasing any evidence that might lead to the child's location." Jane's heart sank. She had been so focused on finding the heir, on uncovering the truth, that she hadn't considered the broader implications. If a powerful organization was involved, then this was much bigger than she had anticipated. "I found something in the files," the man continued, his voice tense. "A reference to a location, a place that might be connected to the heir. It's a long shot, but it's all we have." He pulled out a small piece of paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Jane. She unfolded it and read the address, written in neat, block letters. It was a remote area, far from the town, in the middle of a dense forest. "What is this place?" Jane asked, her curiosity piqued. "It's an old facility," the man replied. "Abandoned now, but it was once used by Mr. Roberts for research. If the heir is still alive, they might have been taken there." Jane stared at the address, her mind buzzing with possibilities. This could be the breakthrough she needed, or it could be a trap. But either way, she knew she had to follow this lead. Before she could say anything else, the man took a step back, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Be careful, Miss Donovan. You're treading on dangerous ground." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jane standing alone in the cold, the slip of paper clutched tightly in her hand. As she made her way back to her car, Jane knew that she was about to enter the most dangerous phase of her investigation yet. The truth was out there, buried deep in the snow-covered forest, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The following morning, Jane awoke to the sound of persistent knocking on her motel room door. She groggily pulled herself out of bed, the events of the previous night still weighing heavily on her mind. As she opened the door, she was surprised to find a stern-looking man in a suit, holding a briefcase. His expression was one of cold professionalism, and Jane's instincts immediately told her that this was not a friendly visit. "Miss Donovan?" the man asked, his tone clipped. "Yes," Jane replied, her guard up. The man nodded curtly and produced a folded document from his briefcase, handing it to her. "You've been served. A temporary restraining order has been filed against you by Mrs. Whelan on behalf of the orphanage. You are hereby prohibited from contacting any of the staff, visiting the orphanage, or conducting any further investigation into the matters concerning Mr. Roberts. Jane's heart sank as she unfolded the document, skimming the legal jargon. The order was thorough, covering every aspect of her investigation. It was clear that Mrs. Whelan had pulled out all the stops to prevent her from digging any deeper. "This is ridiculous," Jane said, trying to keep her voice steady. "They can't just stop me from doing my job." The man's expression didn't change. "I suggest you take this matter seriously, Miss Donovan. Violating the terms of the restraining order could result in legal consequences, including arrest." Jane felt a surge of frustration and helplessness. She had been so close to finding the truth, and now this legal roadblock threatened to undo everything. But she knew that fighting this in court would be time-consuming and expensive, time she didn't have, and money she couldn't afford to waste. The man gave a curt nod and turned to leave, but Jane called after him. "Who filed this? Was it just Mrs. Whelan, or is there someone else involved?" The man paused, his hand on the door handle. For a moment, Jane thought he might ignore her question, but then he glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "You didn't hear it from me, but there's more to this than just Mrs. Whelan. There are powerful people who want this matter closed." With that, he left, leaving Jane standing in the doorway, the restraining order crumpled in her hand. She closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. The anonymous informant's warning about a larger organization now seemed more credible than ever. If these powerful people were involved, then her investigation had just become a lot more dangerous. Jane knew she needed to act quickly. The restraining order was a serious obstacle, but it didn't have to be the end of her investigation. She just needed to be smarter, to find a way around the legal hurdles that had been thrown in her path. She sat down at the small desk in her room, spreading out the documents she had gathered. The address from the informant, the abandoned facility in the forest, was still her best lead. If the heir was there, it would be her chance to finally expose the truth. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed someone who could navigate the legal minefield she was now facing, someone who could help her without drawing too much attention, and she knew exactly who to call. Jane reached for her phone and dialed the number of an old colleague, someone she had worked with on a few tricky cases in the past. The phone rang several times before a familiar voice answered. "Jane, it's been a while," the voice said, a hint of amusement in their tone. "Too long, Nathan," Jane replied, allowing herself a small smile. "I need your help with something big, and it's urgent." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm listening." Jane quickly explained the situation, detailing the restraining order, the involvement of powerful forces, and the lead she had on the abandoned facility. Nathan was silent as she spoke, but Jane could hear the gears turning in his mind. "This sounds messy, Jane," Nathan finally said. "But if anyone can untangle it, it's you. I'll help you, but we need to be careful. If these people are as powerful as you say, they won't hesitate to shut us down, legally or otherwise." Jane's resolve hardened. "I understand the risks, but I have to see this through. Will you help me?" Nathan sighed, but Jane could hear the determination in his voice. "I'm in. Let's find out what's really going on." Jane hung up the phone, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. With Nathan's help, she could navigate the legal obstacles and continue her investigation. But time was running out, and she knew that every step she took would bring her closer to the truth and to the people who wanted it buried. That afternoon, Jane met Nathan at a small cafe on the edge of town, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might be watching her movements. The place was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered at the tables, and the air was filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Nathan sat in a corner booth, his laptop open in front of him as he scrolled through pages of legal documents. Nathan was the kind of lawyer who thrived in the grey areas of the law. He was sharp, resourceful, and unafraid to bend the rules when necessary. Jane knew that if anyone could help her navigate the legal maze she found herself in, it was him. "Jane." Nathan greeted her with a nod as she slid into the seat across from him. "I've been looking over the restraining order. It's pretty airtight, but there are a few loopholes we can exploit." Jane leaned forward, eager to hear more. "What kind of loopholes?" Nathan tapped a few keys on his laptop, bringing up a document. "For starters, the restraining order only applies to the orphanage and its staff. It doesn't cover any external locations or individuals. That means we're free to investigate the address you found without violating the order." Jane felt a surge of relief. "That's good news! What about contacting Sister Agnes? She's technically part of the staff, but she's with me now." Nathan smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "That's the beauty of it. The restraining order applies to you contacting her at the orphanage or during her official duties. Since she's no longer there, you're not in violation by speaking with her." Jane couldn't help but smile. "You're a genius, Nathan." He shrugged modestly. "Just doing my job, but there's one more thing we need to consider, the people behind this. If they're powerful enough to get this restraining order pushed through so quickly, they won't stop at legal means to shut you down. We need to be prepared for anything." Jane nodded, the seriousness of the situation settling in. "I've already seen what they're capable of, but I won't let that stop me. We need to find out what's at that facility." Nathan closed his laptop and leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. "I've been looking into the address you gave me. It's in a pretty isolated area, but it used to be part of a larger network of research facilities owned by a shell corporation. The corporation was linked to Mr. Roberts, but it was dissolved shortly before his death." Jane's mind raced with possibilities. "Do you think that's where the experiments took place?" "It's possible," Nathan said, nodding, "but we won't know for sure until we get there. The place has been abandoned for years, so it could be dangerous. We'll need to be cautious," Jane agreed, the weight of their next move pressing heavily on her shoulders. "We'll leave at dawn. I don't want to waste any more time." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "We..." Jane met his gaze, her expression firm. "I'm not doing this alone, Nathan. I need someone I can trust by my side." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "I knew you were going to say that. All right, I'm in, but if things go south, we get out. No heroics, got it?" Jane smiled, grateful for his support. "Got it." As they finished their coffee and made plans for the next day, Jane felt a renewed sense of determination. With Nathan's legal expertise and the lead on the facility, they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. But the closer they got, the more dangerous the situation became. The real battle was just beginning, and Jane knew that the next 24 hours would be crucial. If they could find the heir and expose the truth, it would all be worth it. But if they failed, the consequences could be devastating. As they left the cafe, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The eyes of the powerful were on them, and every move they made would bring them closer to a confrontation that could change everything. The next morning, the sky was still a deep, pre-dawn grey as Jane and Nathan set off for the abandoned facility in the forest. The drive was long and tense, the winding road leading them deeper into isolation. The trees grew thicker the farther they went, their bare branches twisting together like skeletal hands, blocking out what little light filtered through the overcast sky. Nathan navigated the narrow, snow-covered roads with practiced ease, but Jane's mind was elsewhere, racing through the information they had gathered so far. She couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental awaited them at the facility. Something that would either bring them closer to the truth or pull them deeper into the darkness surrounding Mr. Roberts's legacy. As they neared their destination, the road turned rough, the pavement giving way to gravel and dirt. The car bumped along the uneven terrain until finally they reached a clearing. The facility stood in the center, a stark, weathered building that loomed like a forgotten relic of the past. Jane and Nathan parked the car at the edge of the clearing and stepped out, the cold air biting at their faces. The facility was surrounded by a tall, rusted fence, its gate hanging askew on broken hinges. Beyond it, the building itself was a squat, concrete structure, its windows boarded up and its walls streaked with grime. "This place is a fortress," Nathan muttered, eyeing the fence warily. "No wonder it's been abandoned for so long. It doesn't exactly scream welcoming." Jane nodded, her eyes scanning the perimeter. "We need to find a way in. There's got to be something here that will give us answers." They approached the fence, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Nathan inspected the gate, pushing it tentatively with one hand. It groaned in protest, but swung open enough to let them through. They slipped inside, their breath visible in the cold air as they moved cautiously toward the building. The facility's front door was locked, but Nathan produced a small set of tools from his coat pocket and set to work on the rusted lock. Within moments, it clicked open, and they pushed the door inward, revealing a dark, musty hallway that smelled of damp and decay. Jane flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a long corridor lined with doors on either side. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor was littered with debris, broken glass, old papers, and the remnants of equipment long since abandoned. "Let's split up," Jane suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way. You take the left side, and I'll take the right." Nathan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of separating, but he nodded. "All right, but keep your phone on, and don't take any unnecessary risks." Jane smiled grimly. "When have I ever taken unnecessary risks?" Nathan raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. They each took a side of the hallway, moving cautiously from room to room. The facility was eerily silent, the only sound the occasional creak of old wood or the drip of water from somewhere deep within the walls. As Jane explored, she found what looked like old laboratories, rooms filled with rusted metal tables, shattered glass beakers, and crumbling cabinets. Most of the equipment had been removed or destroyed, leaving behind only the ghostly remnants of whatever experiments had taken place here. But in one of the rooms near the end of the corridor, Jane found something different. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, her flashlight revealed a small office, relatively intact compared to the rest of the facility. The desk was covered in dust, but it still held papers, files, and a few scattered photographs. Jane's pulse quickened as she approached the desk, her eyes drawn to the documents. She picked up a file labeled Project Heir, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside were pages of notes, diagrams, and charts, all written in a precise, clinical hand. The notes described a series of experiments, tests designed to unlock hidden potential in children to create the perfect human being. The language was cold and detached, reducing the children to mere subjects in a grand experiment. But one name stood out among the others, mentioned repeatedly throughout the notes: Subject X, the heir. Jane's heart raced as she flipped through the pages, piecing together the horrific story. Mr. Roberts had believed that one child, Subject X, possessed extraordinary potential, something that could be harnessed and controlled. But the notes were vague about what that potential was and what had ultimately happened to the child. As she reached the last page, Jane found a reference to another location, a secondary facility, one that had been used to continue the experiments after this one had been abandoned. The address was scrawled hastily at the bottom of the page, as if added as an afterthought. Jane tore the page from the file and tucked it into her pocket, her mind racing with the implications. There was more to this than she had ever imagined, and the answers were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. She turned to leave, but as she did, her flashlight caught something on the floor, an envelope, partially hidden beneath the desk. Jane bent down and retrieved it, her breath catching when she saw the name written on it in elegant script. Agnes. It was addressed to Sister Agnes. Jane's hands shook as she opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. The paper was yellowed with age, but the writing was still legible. As she read, her eyes widened in shock. The letter was from Mr. Roberts himself, and it revealed the final piece of the puzzle, the true identity of the heir, and the reason why they had been hidden away. Jane's heart pounded as the truth unfolded before her eyes. This was it, the key to everything. But before she could fully process what she had just learned, she heard a noise from the hallway, a soft creak, followed by the sound of footsteps. Someone was coming. Jane quickly stuffed the letter into her pocket and turned off her flashlight, pressing herself against the wall. The footsteps grew closer, and she held her breath, her mind racing with fear and adrenaline. She couldn't let them find her, not now, not when she was so close. Jane's pulse quickened as the footsteps approached, each one echoing ominously in the narrow hallway. Her mind raced through her options, but there were few. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, the sound loud in her ears as she pressed herself harder against the wall, praying the darkness would conceal her. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Jane's breath caught in her throat as she waited, every muscle in her body tense. She heard the faint rustle of clothing, followed by a low murmur, someone speaking quietly, as if on the phone. A cold sweat broke out on Jane's forehead. She knew that whoever was out there wasn't one of Nathan's allies. This was someone who had followed them here, someone who was working for the same powerful forces that had been trying to stop her investigation from the beginning. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Jane's heart raced as she saw the outline of a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint light from the hallway. The figure stepped inside, their movements cautious, as if searching for something or someone. Jane gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. She had to act fast, but the figure was blocking her only exit. There was no way to escape without being seen. The figure took another step into the room, and Jane's breath hitched as she recognized the familiar voice that broke the silence. "Jane, are you in here?" It was Nathan. Relief flooded through her, and she almost sagged against the wall. But something in his voice gave her pause, an edge of tension that hadn't been there before. "Nathan," she whispered, stepping out of the shadows. "What are you doing here?" Nathan turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I was looking for you," he said, his voice tight. "We need to talk." Jane frowned, sensing that something was off. She had known Nathan for years, and they had always worked well together, but now there was something different in his demeanor, a stiffness, a wariness that made her uneasy. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Nathan hesitated, glancing at the door before taking a step closer to her. "Jane, we're in over our heads. There are people involved in this who are more powerful than we ever imagined. We can't win this fight." Jane's unease grew. "What are you saying, Nathan?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm saying that we need to stop. It's too dangerous. We're putting ourselves and others in serious danger by continuing this investigation." Jane shook her head, her resolve hardening. "We're too close to the truth. We can't stop now." Nathan's eyes flashed with frustration. "Jane, you don't understand. These people, they don't play by the rules. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their interests. If we keep pushing, we're going to get ourselves killed." Jane's mind raced, trying to process what Nathan was saying. It wasn't like him to back down, especially not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. But the fear in his voice was real, and it made her question everything. "Why are you saying this?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Nathan hesitated again, his gaze flicking to the door as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. Because I've seen what they're capable of, he said quietly. And because I made a deal. Jane's blood ran cold. A deal, Nathan nodded, his expression pained. They approached me after you found that address. They offered me a way out, a way to protect us both. But it meant stopping the investigation, leaving everything behind. Jane felt a wave of betrayal wash over her. You made a deal with them. You were going to let them get away with this. Nathan's face twisted with guilt. I didn't want to, Jane, but I couldn't see any other way. They're too powerful. We're just two people. What chance do we have against them? Jane's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of anger and hurt. She had trusted Nathan, relied on him, and now he was telling her that he was willing to abandon everything they had worked for, all for the sake of self-preservation. You don't get it, Nathan, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. This isn't just about us. It's about those children, about the heir. We can't let them win. Nathan looked down, his expression torn. I know, Jane, but we're out of time. They're coming for us. If we don't leave now... Jane didn't let him finish. She turned and bolted for the door, her mind racing with adrenaline. She didn't know who they were or what Nathan had agreed to, but she knew she couldn't trust him anymore. She had to get out of there, had to find the heir before it was too late. Jane, wait! Nathan called after her, but she didn't stop. She burst out of the room and ran down the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get away, had to find a way to finish what she had started. As she reached the entrance to the facility, she heard footsteps behind her. Nathan or someone else. She couldn't tell. She didn't look back. She pushed through the door and out into the cold, the wind biting at her face as she stumbled toward the car. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, but she managed to unlock the door and throw herself inside. The engine roared to life, and she floored the accelerator, the tires spinning in the snow before catching traction and launching her forward. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of Nathan. Her heart pounded as she sped away from the facility, the truth burning in her pocket. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was on her own now, and she wouldn't stop until she found the heir. Jane's hands gripped the steering wheel as she navigated the icy roads, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Betrayal, fear, and determination all vied for dominance as she tried to process what had just happened. Nathan, someone she had trusted implicitly, had turned on her, and now she was alone in her quest to uncover the truth. But that didn't mean she was defeated, not by a long shot. The road ahead was treacherous, but Jane's focus was razor-sharp. She kept glancing at the scrap of paper in her pocket, the address of the secondary facility that she had found in the abandoned office. It was the last lead she had, the final piece of the puzzle that could reveal the heir's identity and the full extent of Mr. Roberts's experiments. As she drove deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around her, their bare branches forming a tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. The snow had started falling again, thick and fast, and Jane knew that she needed to reach the facility before the weather made the roads impassable. After what felt like hours, the forest opened up to reveal a small, secluded clearing. The secondary facility was much smaller than the one she had just left, more of a cabin than a research center. But Jane could see the telltale signs of neglect and decay, boarded-up windows, a sagging roof, and an overgrown path leading to the entrance. She parked the car a safe distance away and approached the cabin on foot, her heart pounding in her chest. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding that made Jane's skin prickle. But she pushed forward, determined to see this through to the end. The front door was unlocked, and Jane slipped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was as dilapidated as the exterior, with broken furniture, scattered papers, and a thick layer of dust coating every surface. But it was clear that this place had once been used for something more sinister. As Jane explored the cabin, she found more evidence of the experiments that had taken place here: charts, medical equipment, and even a few photographs pinned to the walls. But what caught her attention most was a small locked drawer in the corner of the room. It was out of place in the otherwise chaotic space, and Jane's instincts told her that whatever was inside would be important. She searched the room until she found a small key tucked away in a drawer. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The drawer creaked open, revealing a neatly folded document and a small, battered journal. Jane carefully unfolded the document, her eyes widening as she read the contents. It was a birth certificate, but not just any birth certificate. It was for Subject X. The name listed under father was Theodore Roberts, and under mother, the name was blacked out, leaving only a single initial, A. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the implications. Mr. Roberts had fathered this child, the heir, through some unknown means, and had kept the identity of the mother a secret. But the question remained, where was this child now? She turned her attention to the journal, her fingers tracing the worn cover. It was clearly old, the pages yellowed with age. Jane opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the first page. It was written in a woman's handwriting, neat and precise, and the first entry was dated nearly 2 decades ago. As Jane read the entries, a horrifying story began to unfold. The journal belonged to the child's mother, A, who had been forced into the experiment by Mr. Roberts. The entries detailed her fears, her pain, and her growing realization that Mr. Roberts had no intention of letting her or the child go free. The last entry was short, written in a rushed, desperate hand. "They're coming for us. I have to hide him. If anyone finds this, please protect him. He's all that's left of me." Tears stung Jane's eyes as she closed the journal. The mother had tried to protect her child, but there was no way of knowing if she had succeeded. Jane knew that this journal was the key to finding the heir, but time was running out. The people who wanted to keep this secret buried were closing in, and Jane was their next target. She quickly gathered the journal and the birth certificate, tucking them safely into her bag. As she did, she noticed a small folded map hidden at the bottom of the drawer. She unfolded it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw a red X marking a location deep in the forest. It was the last clue she needed, the location where the heir had been hidden. Jane knew she had no choice but to follow the map. The cabin might have been the site of terrible experiments, but the real answer, the heir, was still out there, waiting to be found, and Jane was determined to find them before it was too late. With the map clutched tightly in her hand, Jane raced back to her car, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The revelation that Mr. Roberts was the father of the heir had shifted everything. The stakes were higher than ever, and she knew she had to find the heir before those who sought to control or destroy them did. The snowstorm had intensified, turning the forest into a white maze of indistinguishable paths. Jane's car struggled through the deepening snow, the tires slipping on the icy road as she followed the map's directions. The red X on the map was her only guide, leading her farther and farther away from any semblance of civilization. As she drove, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. The betrayal by Nathan had rattled her, making her question everyone's motives. She kept checking her rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights cutting through the darkness behind her. But the road remained empty, the forest eerily silent. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jane reached the end of the road. The map indicated that she would need to continue on foot from here, through the dense forest to a remote location. She parked the car under a canopy of trees, hoping it would be concealed from anyone who might be looking for her. Jane stepped out into the freezing night, pulling her coat tighter around her as she started down the narrow, snow-covered path. The cold was biting, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her moving. She could feel the weight of the journal and the birth certificate in her bag, a constant reminder of the truth she was carrying. The forest was thick and oppressive, the tall trees blocking out what little light the moon provided. Jane's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only a few feet ahead of her at a time. Every sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle of branches made her heart race. She was completely alone, surrounded by the unknown. After what felt like an eternity of walking, Jane finally reached the spot marked on the map. It was a small, secluded clearing with a single structure in the center, a small, weathered cabin, much like the one she had just left. The place had an air of abandonment, but Jane knew better than to trust appearances. She approached the cabin cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the door. It was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Jane's breath caught in her throat as she realized that someone had been here recently. She stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room. The interior was sparse, just a few pieces of old furniture and a fireplace filled with cold ashes. But it was the figure sitting in the corner that made Jane freeze in her tracks. Mrs. Whelan. She was sitting calmly, her hands folded in her lap, as if she had been waiting for Jane to arrive. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a coldness in her eyes that sent a chill down Jane's spine. "Miss Donovan," Mrs. Whelan said, her voice low and controlled. "I was wondering when you'd get here." Jane's mind raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. How had Mrs. Whelan found this place? And more importantly, why was she here? "What are you doing here?" Jane demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Mrs. Whelan stood slowly, her movements deliberate. "I could ask you the same question, but we both know why we're here, don't we? You've been digging into things that were never meant to be uncovered." Jane's heart pounded as she took a step back, her eyes darting around the room. There was no sign of the heir, no indication that anyone else had been here recently. But Mrs. Whelan's presence told her that she was close, too close. "Where is the heir?" Jane demanded, her voice firmer now. Mrs. Whelan's smile was thin, almost pitying. "The heir is safe, Miss Donovan, and they will remain safe as long as you stop this foolish investigation." Jane's mind raced as she tried to figure out her next move. Mrs. Whelan was clearly dangerous, and Jane knew she was no match for whatever forces the director had at her disposal. But she couldn't back down now, not when she was so close to the truth. "You're not going to stop me," Jane said, her voice resolute. "I'll find the heir, and I'll expose everything that you and Mr. Roberts have done." Mrs. Whelan's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "I'm afraid you won't get that chance." Before Jane could react, Mrs. Whelan reached into her coat and pulled out a gun, leveling it at Jane's chest. The cold metal gleamed in the dim light, and Jane's heart skipped a beat as she realized just how serious the situation had become. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long, Miss Donovan," Mrs. Whelan said, her voice steady. "It's time for this to end." Jane's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out, but there was no time. No escape. Mrs. Whelan had the upper hand, and Jane knew that her life was hanging by a thread. But just as Mrs. Whelan tightened her grip on the trigger, the cabin door burst open with a crash. The force of it sent snow swirling into the room, and Jane barely had time to register the figure that stormed in, moving with deadly precision. It was Nathan. He tackled Mrs. Whelan to the ground, the gun flying from her hand and skittering across the floor. Jane's heart pounded as she watched the struggle, unsure of what to do. She wanted to help, but the fear of making things worse kept her rooted to the spot. Nathan and Mrs. Whelan wrestled for control, each trying to gain the upper hand, but Nathan's strength eventually won out, and he managed to pin Mrs. Whelan to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Jane, run!" Nathan shouted, his voice strained. Jane hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the need to stay and help. But she knew that Nathan was right. She had to get out of there while she still could. She grabbed the journal and the birth certificate from her bag and bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back as she raced through the snow, her mind focused on one thing: finding the heir and bringing this nightmare to an end. The confrontation had intensified, and the stakes had never been higher. But Jane wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. The icy wind bit into Jane's face as she ran through the forest, the trees a blur of dark shadows around her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning her lungs, but she didn't dare slow down. Nathan's shout echoed in her ears, urging her to flee, to find safety before Mrs. Whelan, or worse, caught up to her. She clutched the journal and birth certificate tightly against her chest as she navigated the treacherous path. The map, now almost crumpled beyond recognition, guided her through the maze of trees toward the only place she hoped might offer some refuge. The snow beneath her boots was deep, slowing her progress. But Jane pushed forward, driven by a single, desperate thought. She had to find the heir. After what felt like hours of running, the forest suddenly opened up, revealing a small, secluded clearing. In the center stood a tiny, unassuming cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. Jane's heart skipped a beat. This had to be the place. This was where the heir had been hidden, where the final pieces of the puzzle would fall into place. She approached the cabin cautiously, her breath fogging the air as she reached for the door. It creaked open with a groan, revealing a dark, cramped interior. The only light came from a small, flickering candle on a table in the center of the room. Jane's pulse quickened as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the heir. But the cabin was empty. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her. Had she come all this way, risked everything, only to arrive too late? But then she noticed something. On the table next to the candle was a small, folded piece of paper, weighted down by a stone. Jane's hands trembled as she picked it up, carefully unfolding it to reveal a single, handwritten line. "Follow the light." Jane's brow furrowed in confusion. What light? She glanced around the cabin, but there was nothing else. No sign of anyone. No clue as to where the heir might be. But as she stepped back outside, the answer became clear. In the distance, through the thick forest, Jane saw a faint glow, small and flickering, like a beacon. It was barely visible through the trees, but it was unmistakable, the light. Without a second thought, Jane began to run toward it, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of urgency. The snow clung to her boots, slowing her progress. But she didn't stop. She had come too far to turn back now. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, illuminating the snow-covered ground around it. Finally, Jane reached the source, a small lantern hanging from the branch of a tree at the edge of another clearing. But this clearing was different. It was larger, more open, and in the center stood a figure, shrouded in shadow. Jane's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, the light from the lantern casting long shadows across the ground. The figure turned slowly to face her, and Jane's heart skipped a beat. It was a child, a young boy, no older than 10, with wide, frightened eyes. He was bundled in a thick coat, his cheeks red from the cold, but there was something about him that immediately struck Jane. There was a sense of familiarity, a connection she couldn't quite explain. The heir. "Who are you?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. Jane's heart ached at the fear in his voice. She took a slow, careful step forward, her hands held out in a gesture of peace. "I'm here to help you," she said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." The boy's eyes flicked to the journal in Jane's hands, and his expression changed. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. "That's my mother's," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jane's breath hitched. "Your mother, she left this for you, to protect you. She wanted to keep you safe." The boy nodded, but his expression remained guarded. "They told me to wait here. They said someone would come for me." Jane's mind raced. "Who told you that? Was it Mrs. Whelan?" The boy shook his head, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "No, it was a man. He said he was my father's friend, that he was going to take me somewhere safe." Jane's blood ran cold. Whoever had been looking for the heir had already found him, and now they were closing in. She didn't have much time. "I'm here to take you to safety," Jane said firmly, "but we need to leave now. There are people coming who want to hurt you, and we can't let them find us." The boy hesitated, his eyes searching Jane's face as if trying to decide whether to trust her. Finally, he nodded, taking a tentative step forward. Jane reached out and took his hand, her heart swelling with a fierce determination. She wasn't going to let anything happen to him, not now, not ever. They turned to leave the clearing, but before they could take more than a few steps, the sound of crunching snow reached Jane's ears. She froze, pulling the boy close as she scanned the trees for the source of the noise. And then she saw them, dark figures emerging from the shadows, closing in from all sides. Jane's heart pounded in her chest as she realized they were surrounded. The plot was unraveling, and the endgame was in sight. But Jane wasn't going down without a fight. The clearing seemed to shrink as the dark figures emerged from the trees, their faces hidden in the shadows. Jane's heart raced as she tightened her grip on the boy's hand, instinctively stepping in front of him to shield him from whatever was coming. She scanned the figures, searching for any sign of recognition, but they remained faceless, anonymous. "Stay behind me," Jane whispered to the boy, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The figures advanced slowly, deliberately, their movements coordinated and precise. Jane could feel the tension in the air, a palpable threat that made her skin crawl. She knew that whoever these people were, they weren't here to help. One of the figures stepped forward, breaking away from the group. As they moved into the light of the lantern, Jane's breath caught in her throat. It was Nathan. His face was drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. He held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, but Jane didn't let her guard down. The betrayal still stung, and she knew better than to trust him now. "Nathan," Jane said, her voice cold and sharp, "what are you doing here?" Nathan's gaze flicked to the boy, and then back to Jane. "I didn't want it to end like this," he said quietly, "but they left me no choice." Jane's heart sank. "You betrayed me. You betrayed him." Nathan's expression faltered, but he didn't back down. "I had to, Jane. They would have killed us both if I didn't, but it's not too late. We can still end this. Just give them the boy and you can walk away." The boy tightened his grip on Jane's hand, his small fingers trembling with fear. Jane's resolve hardened. "I'm not giving him to you, Nathan. I don't care what they threatened you with. I'm not going to let them hurt him." Nathan's eyes filled with desperation. "Jane, please. You don't understand. These people they're not going to stop. If you don't give them what they want, they'll kill you. They'll kill both of you." Jane's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't waver. She had come too far, risked too much. To back down now. "I'm not afraid of them, Nathan. And I'm not afraid of you." Nathan's expression hardened, and Jane saw the flicker of regret in his eyes before he turned away. He gestured to the other figures, and they began to close in, their movements slow and deliberate. Jane's mind raced, searching for a way out. She couldn't fight them, not with the boy in tow, and there was no way they could outrun them in the deep snow. But she couldn't let them take the boy. She couldn't let them win. "Run," Jane whispered to the boy, pushing him gently toward the trees. "Run as fast as you can, and don't look back." The boy hesitated, his wide eyes filled with fear, but Jane gave him a firm nod. "Go." He turned, and bolted into the trees, his small figure quickly disappearing into the darkness. Jane's heart ached as she watched him go, but she knew it was the only chance he had. She would buy him as much time as she could. The figures advanced faster now, realizing that the boy was escaping. Jane stood her ground, blocking their path, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Nathan's expression twisted with frustration. "Jane, don't do this. It doesn't have to end like this." But Jane didn't move. "Yes, it does." The first of the figures lunged at her, and Jane barely had time to react. She ducked to the side, throwing her weight into them and sending them crashing to the ground. But there were too many. Within seconds, she was surrounded, overwhelmed. They grabbed her arms, pulling her to the ground. Jane struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. They were too strong, too well prepared. She felt the cold snow pressing against her cheek as they pinned her down, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Nathan knelt beside her, his expression filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Jane," he whispered. "I really am." Jane's vision blurred as she fought to stay conscious. She had failed. The boy was gone, but for how long? And what would happen to him now that she couldn't protect him? But just as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole, she heard a sound, distant at first, but growing louder. It was the sound of voices, shouting, and the unmistakable roar of engines. The figures froze, their grip on her loosening as they turned to face the approaching noise. Jane struggled to lift her head, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. The cavalry had arrived, but whose side were they on? The figures around her began to scatter, retreating into the shadows as the noise grew louder. Nathan hesitated, glancing back at Jane one last time before he, too, disappeared into the trees. Jane lay in the snow, her breath coming in short, painful gasps as the headlights of a dozen vehicles burst through the darkness, illuminating the clearing. Figures in uniform, police perhaps, or something else, poured out, their voices loud and commanding. They had come for the boy, but had they come to save him or to take him away? The clearing buzzed with activity as the vehicles came to a halt, their headlights cutting through the thick snow and casting long shadows across the forest. Jane lay on the ground, the cold seeping into her bones as she tried to make sense of the chaos unfolding around her. The figures in uniform moved quickly, their voices sharp and authoritative as they fanned out across the clearing. A pair of boots crunched in the snow near her head, and Jane forced herself to look up. A man in a dark uniform knelt beside her, his expression unreadable behind the visor of his helmet. He reached down, gently but firmly, to help her sit up. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft given the situation. Jane winced as she pushed herself into a sitting position, her body aching from the struggle. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice was weak. "The boy, you have to find him." The man nodded, signaling to a group of his colleagues. "We're on it. Stay here. We'll take care of this." Jane wanted to protest, to tell them that she needed to be the one to find the boy, but she knew she didn't have the strength. She watched as the officers, she assumed they were some kind of law enforcement, though their uniforms were unfamiliar, spread out into the forest, their flashlights sweeping through the trees. The leader stayed with her, offering her a blanket to stave off the cold. Jane accepted it gratefully, wrapping it around herself as she tried to process everything that had happened. The betrayal, the confrontation, the boy's desperate flight into the woods. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "Who are you?" Jane asked, her voice hoarse. "What organization are you with?" The man hesitated, glancing at the badge on his chest. "We're with a special task force. We've been monitoring the situation for some time now. We couldn't intervene until we had confirmation of the boy's location." Jane frowned, her mind racing with questions. "Monitoring? What do you mean?" The man's expression was grim. "Mr. Roberts' activities didn't go unnoticed. There were people, powerful people who were aware of what he was doing, but they couldn't act without concrete evidence. That's where you came in. Your investigation brought everything to light. Jane's heart sank as she realized the full extent of what he was saying. She had been a pawn in a much larger game, used to draw out the truth so that others could swoop in and take control. "And now," Jane asked, her voice trembling, "what happens to the boy?" The man's expression softened slightly. "He'll be taken somewhere safe, where he can be protected. But you've done your part, Miss Donovan. You've exposed the truth, and that's all we needed." Jane's heart ached at the thought of the boy being taken away, hidden from the world like a secret that couldn't be allowed to see the light of day. But she knew she was in no position to argue. She was too weak, too battered by the events of the past few days. Just as she was about to resign herself to her fate, the radio on the man's shoulder crackled to life. "We found him," a voice reported. "He's safe, but he's scared. We're bringing him in now." Jane's heart leapt with relief, and she struggled to her feet, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "I need to see him," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "Please, let me see him." The man hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you have to understand, this is the end of the line for you. Once we take him, you won't be able to contact him again." Jane's chest tightened, but she nodded in understanding. She had known from the beginning that this might be the outcome, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. The officer led her through the snow-covered clearing to where the boy was being brought out of the forest. He was wrapped in a thick coat, his eyes wide and frightened, but when he saw Jane, he broke free from the officer holding him and ran to her, throwing his arms around her waist. Jane knelt down, pulling him close, her heart breaking at the thought of saying goodbye. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They're going to take care of you. You're going to be okay." The boy clung to her, his small body trembling. "Don't leave me," he pleaded, his voice muffled against her coat. "Please don't leave me." Tears filled Jane's eyes as she held him tightly, wishing she could promise him the world. But she knew the truth. She couldn't stay with him, couldn't protect him from the forces that would inevitably seek to control him. All she could do was give him a small piece of hope. "I'll always be with you," Jane whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "In here," she placed a hand over his heart, her tears falling freely now. "No matter what happens, I'll be with you." The boy looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I'll remember," he said softly. Jane nodded, forcing a smile. "Good." The officer who had stayed with her stepped forward, gently pulling the boy away. Jane let him go, her heart breaking with every step he took away from her. She watched as the boy was led to one of the vehicles, where he would be taken far away from the nightmare that had shaped his young life. As the door closed behind him, Jane felt a part of herself close as well. She had done everything she could, uncovered the truth, found the heir, and ensured his safety. But at what cost? The officer turned back to her, his expression somber. "Thank you, Miss Donovan. You've done a great service. We'll make sure he's protected." Jane nodded numbly, unable to find the words to respond. The relief of knowing the boy was safe was overshadowed by the weight of what she had lost, her chance to be a part of his life, to protect him as she had promised. As the vehicles began to pull away, disappearing into the snow-covered forest, Jane stood alone in the clearing, the cold wind whipping around her. The final stand had been made, but the cost was heavy, and now all that was left was the aftermath. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jane. The special task force had made good on their promise, ensuring that the boy was taken to a safe, undisclosed location where he would be protected from those who sought to exploit him. But Jane knew that the story wasn't over, not for her, and not for the world. She returned to the small town that had been the epicenter of her investigation. the events of the past few weeks weighing heavily on her shoulders. The mansion, the orphanage, the hidden facilities, all of it had been exposed, but the question remained. How would the world react to the truth? Jane knew that she couldn't stay silent. The boy might be safe for now, but the secrets she had uncovered were too important to be buried. The world needed to know what had happened, to understand the depths of Mr. Roberts's deception and the lengths to which powerful people would go to protect their interests. She began writing, pouring everything she had discovered into a comprehensive report. She documented every detail, every file, every conversation, every revelation. The journal, the birth certificate, the experiments, they were all laid bare in her report, a testament to the horrors that had been hidden for so long. But she knew that writing the report wasn't enough. She needed to find someone who could help her bring the story to the world, someone who had the resources and reach to ensure that the truth wouldn't be suppressed. It didn't take long for her to find the right person. A well-known investigative journalist, someone with a reputation for exposing corruption and injustice, agreed to meet with her. Jane traveled to the city, her report clutched tightly in her hands as she walked into the sleek, modern office building where the journalist worked. The journalist, David Carter, was waiting for her in a glass-walled conference room, his sharp eyes watching her as she approached. He was a man in his late 40s, with a reputation for being relentless in his pursuit of the truth. Jane had read his work, admired his tenacity, and knew that if anyone could bring her story to light, it was him. "Miss Donovan," David greeted her, his voice calm and measured as he extended a hand. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Jane shook his hand, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. "I'm sure you have, and I'm sure you know why I'm here." David gestured for her to sit, his gaze never leaving her face. "You've uncovered something big, haven't you? Something that certain people would rather keep buried." Jane nodded, her grip tightening on the report in her lap. "It's bigger than I ever imagined, and I need your help to make sure it's exposed." David leaned back in his chair, studying her intently. "Why don't you start from the beginning and tell me everything?" Jane took a deep breath and began to recount her journey, how she had been hired to find the secret heir of Mr. Roberts, how her investigation had led her deeper into a web of deception and danger, and how she had uncovered the horrific experiments that had been conducted in the name of creating a perfect human being. She spoke of the betrayals, the fear, and the final confrontation in the forest, all while David listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. When she finally finished, Jane placed the thick report on the table, sliding it across to him. "Everything is in there. Names, dates, evidence. It's all documented. But I need someone with the reach and resources to bring it to the public. That's where you come in." David picked up the report, flipping through the pages with a practiced eye. The weight of what he was holding wasn't lost on him. Jane could see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed the implications of what she had uncovered. "This is massive," David finally said, looking up at Jane. "If even half of this is true, it's going to shake a lot of powerful people. Are you prepared for what's going to happen once this goes public?" Jane nodded, though she felt a pang of uncertainty. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. "The world needs to know the truth, no matter the consequences. This isn't just about the boy. It's about holding those responsible accountable for their actions." David leaned back in his chair, his expression one of cautious admiration. "You're a brave woman, Miss Donovan. This story, it's going to change everything. But you need to understand that once we go down this road, there's no undoing it. People are going to come after you, people with a lot to lose." "I've already faced that," Jane replied, her voice steady, "and I'm still standing. I'm not going to let them intimidate me into silence." David gave her a slow nod, clearly impressed by her resolve. "All right, then. I'll take it from here. I have contacts in the media who can help amplify this, and I'll make sure every detail is verified and corroborated before we publish. This story won't be buried, not if I have anything to say about it." A wave of relief washed over Jane. She had done her part, and now it was in David's hands. She trusted him to do what was right, to bring the truth to light in a way that would ensure it couldn't be ignored. "Thank you," Jane said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for helping me make sure the truth is known." David stood, offering her a handshake once more. "It's the least I can do. You've done something incredible, Jane. You've given a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. Now, let's make sure the world hears it." Jane left the office with a sense of closure, though it was tinged with the knowledge that her fight was far from over. There would be fallout. There always was when powerful people were exposed. But she had done what she could to protect the boy, and she had ensured that the truth would come to light. As she walked through the bustling streets of the city, Jane felt a strange mixture of peace and anticipation. The media would play a crucial role in shaping the public's perception of what had happened, and she knew that David would handle the story with the care and integrity it deserved. But for now, all she could do was wait. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Jane kept a low profile, staying in a small, rented apartment in the city as she waited for David's team to finish their work. She knew that once the story broke, there would be no going back. Her life would be forever changed, as would the lives of those involved in Mr. Roberts' twisted legacy. It was late in the evening, nearly a week after her meeting with David, when Jane received the call. She had been sitting by the window, staring out at the city's twinkling lights, when her phone buzzed on the table beside her. The number was unfamiliar, but she knew it had to be David. "Jane, it's David." His voice came through the line, sounding more tense than she had ever heard it. "We've got a problem." Jane's heart skipped a beat. "What is it? What's wrong?" "There's been a leak," David said, his voice tight with frustration. "Someone on the inside must have tipped them off. The story is out, but it's being twisted. They're painting you as a conspiracy theorist, discrediting everything we've uncovered. They're trying to bury the truth by discrediting you." Jane's blood ran cold. She had expected resistance, but not this, an outright smear campaign aimed at destroying her credibility before the truth could even be fully revealed. "What do we do?" Jane asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "We fight back," David replied, his tone resolute. "We've got the evidence, the documentation, everything we need to prove our case, but we need to act fast. They're moving quickly, trying to control the narrative before we can get our story out there." Jane nodded, though he couldn't see her. "What do you need from me?" "Meet me at the office," David said. "We're going to go live with the story. We'll put everything out there at once, documents, interviews, the whole 9 yards. If we can get it out before they completely discredit you, we stand a chance." Jane didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up the phone, her mind racing as she grabbed her coat and keys. The showdown she had been dreading was finally here, and it was going to be a battle for the truth, a battle she couldn't afford to lose. The streets were nearly empty as she drove through the city, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The smear campaign had hit faster and harder than she had anticipated, but she wasn't about to back down. She had come too far to let them silence her now. When she arrived at David's office, the tension in the air was palpable. The team of journalists and editors were moving with a sense of urgency, their eyes fixed on computer screens as they worked to finalize the story. David was waiting for her at the door, his expression grim but determined. "They're going after you hard, Jane," he said as she approached, "but we've got everything we need to counter their lies. Once we go live, there'll be no stopping it." Jane nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Let's do it." David led her to a small conference room where a camera was set up. "We're going to film your statement, then release the full report. We've got lawyers on standby in case they try to shut us down, but once it's out there, it'll be impossible to take back." Jane took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She had never been one for the spotlight, but this was bigger than her. This was about the truth and about justice for those who had been wronged. She sat down in front of the camera, her heart pounding in her chest as the lights were adjusted and the microphone was clipped to her lapel. David gave her a reassuring nod from behind the camera, and then the red light blinked on. "Whenever you're ready," David said softly. Jane looked directly into the camera, her expression resolute. "My name is Jane Donovan, and I'm here to tell you the truth about Mr. Theodore Roberts and the experiments he conducted in the name of philanthropy." As she spoke, Jane felt a sense of calm wash over her. The words flowed easily now, the story she had uncovered spilling out into the open for the world to see. She spoke of the boy, the heir, and the monstrous acts that had been committed in the name of creating something perfect. She laid bare the evidence, the files, and the journal, everything she had risked her life to uncover. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. David nodded to the cameraman, who shut off the camera and began preparing the footage for release. "You did great, Jane," David said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "Now let's get this out there." The minutes that followed were some of the longest of Jane's life. She watched as the video was uploaded, the report published online, and the documents disseminated to every major news outlet. It was out of her hands now, the truth was in the open, and it was up to the world to decide what to do with it. As the first waves of responses began to pour in, both supportive and hostile, Jane realized that the real showdown was just beginning. But she was ready. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She had done everything she could, and now, whatever came next, she would face it head-on. The world knew the truth. Now, it was time for justice. The fallout from the story's release was immediate and intense. As Jane watched the news unfold, she saw the world react with a mix of shock, outrage, and disbelief. The revelations about Mr. Roberts's experiments and the conspiracy to cover them up sent ripples through every corner of society. The media firestorm was relentless, with every major outlet picking up the story, dissecting the details, and demanding answers. But with the truth out in the open, the backlash began to build. Powerful figures who had been complicit in the cover-up scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, their lawyers and public relations teams working overtime to control the damage. The smear campaign against Jane intensified, with accusations and fabricated stories aimed at discrediting her and undermining the evidence she had presented. Jane knew this would happen. She had prepared herself for it, but it didn't make it any easier. As the days passed, she found herself under constant scrutiny, her every move monitored, her motives questioned. The weight of it all began to take its toll, but Jane remained steadfast. She had known that there would be a price to pay for exposing the truth, and she was willing to pay it. David and his team did their best to shield her from the worst of the attacks, but even they couldn't prevent the onslaught. Anonymous threats, lawsuits, and attempts to discredit her past flooded in, each one more vicious than the last. Jane's life had been turned upside down, and she quickly realized that there was no going back to the way things were. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of interviews and legal consultations, Jane sat alone in her apartment, the weight of the world pressing down on her. The television flickered in the background, broadcasting yet another panel of pundits debating the legitimacy of her claims. Jane barely heard them, her mind lost in a fog of exhaustion and despair. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, and she picked it up, half expecting another call from David or one of the lawyers. But when she saw the number on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was the boy. Jane's hands shook as she answered the call, bringing the phone to her ear. "Hello?" "Jane?" The boy's voice was small, hesitant, but unmistakably his. "Are you okay?" Tears sprang to Jane's eyes at the sound of his voice. "I'm fine, sweetheart. How are you? Are they taking care of you?" "They're nice," he replied, his voice still uncertain. "But I miss you." Jane's heart broke at his words. She had been trying to distance herself from the pain of their separation, to focus on the bigger picture, but hearing his voice brought it all crashing down. "I miss you too," she whispered, her voice trembling. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when the boy spoke again, his voice was filled with fear. "Jane, are they going to hurt you? The people on the TV, they keep saying bad things about you." Jane closed her eyes, the tears spilling over. "No, sweetheart, they're just scared because the truth is coming out, but I'm not going to let them hurt me, okay? I'm going to be just fine." The boy was silent for a moment, and then he whispered, "I'm scared, Jane." Jane took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay strong. "I know, but you're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. And I'm going to keep fighting to make sure the truth is known, no matter what." She heard the boy sniffle on the other end of the line. "Promise?" "I promise," Jane said, her voice steady. "No matter what happens, I'll always be fighting for you." The call ended shortly after she and Jane was left staring at the phone, her emotions a tangled mess. She knew she had made the right decision in exposing the truth, but the cost was becoming more apparent with each passing day. The boy was safe, but she had lost him, and the world around her was closing in. That night, Jane made a decision. She knew that to protect the boy and ensure the truth wasn't buried, she would have to make a sacrifice, a final, irrevocable act that would distance her from the boy and the story she had brought to light. It was the only way to ensure his safety and protect him from the people who would stop at nothing to control him. The next morning, Jane called David and requested a meeting. They sat down in his office, the tension between them palpable. "I've been thinking," Jane began, her voice calm but resolute. "I need to step back, disappear for a while. They're using me as a target to discredit the story, and as long as I'm here, they're going to keep coming after me." David's expression was one of concern. "Jane, are you sure about this? The story is out there, but it's still going to need you to keep the pressure on if you step away now." "I know," Jane interrupted gently, "but I can't protect the boy if I'm constantly under attack. I've done my part. Now it's up to you and the others to make sure the truth isn't buried." David looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're going off the grid, aren't you?" Jane nodded. "It's the only way. I've already made arrangements. I'll be safe, but I can't stay in the spotlight. Not if I want to keep him safe." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're a brave woman, Jane. I wish it didn't have to come to this." "So do I," Jane said softly. "But this is the only way." They talked for a while longer, finalizing the details of her departure. Jane knew that once she left, there would be no coming back, not for a long time, if ever. But she had made her peace with that. The boy was safe, the truth was out, and she had done everything she could. The next day, Jane disappeared from the public eye. She left behind her apartment, her old life, and everything she had known. The media continued to swirl with speculation, but Jane was gone, just another ghost in the machine. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, but it was a sacrifice she was willing to make. The weeks that followed Jane's disappearance were some of the most difficult of her life. She had cut all ties with the outside world, living in isolation in a remote cabin far from the city, far from anyone who might recognize her. The only connection she maintained was with David, who kept her informed of the ongoing battle to keep the truth alive. As she sat by the fireplace one evening, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls, Jane felt the full weight of her decision. The loneliness was profound, more intense than anything she had ever experienced. She had always been someone who thrived on connection, on helping others, and now she was completely cut off, forced to watch from the sidelines as the world moved on without her. David's updates were a mixed bag. The story had taken on a life of its own, with new revelations and developments coming to light almost daily. Some of the powerful figures implicated in the scandal had been forced to resign, their reputations in tatters. There were even talks of criminal investigations, though Jane knew that bringing true justice would be an uphill battle. But despite the progress, the smear campaign against her had only intensified. Her name was dragged through the mud, her credibility attacked from every angle. Conspiracy theories flourished, painting her as a delusional woman with an agenda, someone who had fabricated the entire story for attention or personal gain. The boy's existence was questioned, with some claiming he was nothing more than a figment of her imagination. Jane knew this would happen. She had prepared herself for it, but the reality of it was harder to bear than she had anticipated. The isolation, the constant barrage of lies and misinformation, the knowledge that she couldn't defend herself, it all weighed heavily on her. There were days when she questioned whether she had made the right choice, whether the sacrifice had been worth it. One night, as she sat in the darkness of her cabin, staring out at the snow-covered landscape, the doubts overwhelmed her. The loneliness was crushing, the silence suffocating. She had lost everything, her career, her identity, even her sense of purpose. The world had moved on, and she was left behind, forgotten and vilified. For the first time in a long time, Jane felt truly alone. The darkness crept in, the shadows of doubt and despair whispering in her ear. What was the point of it all? The boy was safe, but at what cost? She had given up everything, and for what? A story that might never be fully believed, a truth that could still be buried under the weight of lies and deceit. As the night wore on, the doubts grew louder, the loneliness more acute. Jane found herself wondering if she had made a mistake, if she had sacrificed too much. The isolation, the constant fear of being found, it was all too much to bear. The thought of giving up, of letting the darkness consume her, crossed her mind more than once. But then, as she sat there, lost in the depths of her despair, she thought of the boy. She remembered his voice on the phone, the fear and uncertainty in his words, and the way he had clung to her in the clearing. She thought of the promise she had made to him, that she would always be fighting for him, that she would always be with him in spirit, even if they were separated. The memory of that moment, of his trust and reliance on her, brought a spark of resolve back into her heart. Jane straightened in her chair, wiping the tears from her eyes. She couldn't give up, not now. The boy was safe because of her, and she had to hold on to that. The world might be trying to tear her down, to erase her from the narrative, but the truth was out there, and it was making waves. She had done something important, something that mattered. That was worth the sacrifice. The next day, she decided to reach out to David again. She couldn't stay completely disconnected, not when there was still work to be done. They had agreed on a secure communication method before she left, and now she used it to send him a brief message. "I'm still here. What's the latest?" David's response came quickly. "The story is holding strong. We've got more evidence coming in, and public opinion is starting to turn. People are questioning the smear campaign against you. Some of the key players are starting to crack under the pressure." Jane felt a small surge of hope. The tide was beginning to turn. The truth was too powerful to be buried forever, and the lies that had been spun around her were starting to unravel. As the days turned into weeks, Jane found a new routine. She spent her mornings reading updates from David, keeping herself informed of the ongoing battle to keep the truth alive. In the afternoons, she wrote, documenting her thoughts, her experiences, and everything she had learned throughout this ordeal. It was a way to process her emotions, to keep her mind sharp, and to remind herself why she had done what she did. One evening, a few weeks after she had gone off the grid, Jane received a message from David that made her heart skip a beat. "I've got something you need to see. It's important." He sent her a link to a video that had been uploaded to a secure site. Jane clicked on it, her hands trembling as the screen came to life. The video was grainy, clearly recorded on a phone, but Jane recognized the setting immediately. It was a television interview, and the person speaking was one of the high-profile figures who had been implicated in Mr. Roberts' scandal. But what caught Jane's attention wasn't the man's face. It was the content of his speech. "I can't do this anymore," the man said, his voice strained. "I've been lying to the public to protect myself, to protect others. But the truth is out there, and I can't keep hiding from it. Jane Donovan was right. Everything she said, it's all true. The experiments, the cover-ups, the boy, it's real, and it's time we faced the consequences." Jane's breath caught in her throat as the man continued to speak, laying bare the lies that had been told, the crimes that had been committed. He was confessing, on live television no less, and his words were sending shockwaves through the media. The video ended, leaving Jane in stunned silence. She had never expected this, an outright confession, a validation of everything she had fought for. It was a turning point, one that could shift public opinion in her favor and bring those responsible to justice. Her phone buzzed again with another message from David. "This is just the beginning, Jane. More are coming forward. The truth is winning." Jane sat back in her chair, a sense of relief washing over her. The darkest hour was passing, and the dawn was beginning to break. The sacrifices she had made, the isolation she had endured, it had all been worth it. The truth was finally coming to light, and the world was starting to see her for what she truly was, a fighter for justice. She wasn't out of the woods yet. There would still be challenges ahead, and the battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Jane felt a glimmer of hope. The boy was safe, the truth was winning, and she had played a crucial role in making it all happen. She had found her purpose again, and she was ready to see this through to the end. The weeks that followed the confession were a whirlwind of events that culminated in a seismic shift in public opinion. The confession video had gone viral, leading to a cascade of similar admissions from other key figures involved in the cover-up. As the truth continued to unfold, the media frenzy that had once been focused on discrediting Jane began to turn its attention to those who had perpetrated and enabled Mr. Roberts' experiments. Jane's name, once dragged through the mud, was slowly being redeemed. Journalists who had once been skeptical or outright hostile toward her began to acknowledge the validity of her claims. Major news outlets published in-depth exposés on the scandal, many of which highlighted Jane's role in bringing the truth to light. The smear campaign that had seemed so overwhelming just weeks before was now crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. David kept Jane updated on the progress, his messages increasingly optimistic as the tide continued to turn. "We're winning, Jane," he wrote in one message. "People are finally seeing the truth for what it is. You've done something incredible." But even as the world began to recognize her efforts, Jane remained in hiding. She knew that the battle wasn't truly over, that there were still those who would seek to silence her if given the chance. She had to be cautious, to protect herself and the boy until the dust had truly settled. One day, however, David sent a message that made Jane's heart skip a beat. "There's someone who wants to meet you. He says it's important." Jane hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. She had been careful to avoid any contact with the outside world beyond her communication with David, but something about this request felt different. She trusted David, and if he thought this meeting was important, then it probably was. "Who is it?" Jane typed back, her fingers trembling slightly as she awaited his response. A moment later, David replied, "The boy." Jane's breath caught in her throat. The boy? He wanted to see her. She had thought she would never see him again, had resigned herself to the idea that their paths would never cross. But now, the possibility of a reunion filled her with a mixture of joy and trepidation. "Is it safe?" she asked, her mind racing with concerns. David's response was reassuring. "Yes. The task force overseeing his protection has given the green light. They think it's important for him to have closure. And honestly, Jane, I think you need it too." Jane's heart pounded as she considered his words. Closure. That was something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for. She had been so focused on surviving, on keeping the boy safe, that she hadn't stopped to think about what it would mean to see him again. "Where and when?" Jane typed. Her decision made. David provided the details, a secure, undisclosed location where the boy had been staying since his rescue. The meeting would be brief, carefully monitored, but it would give them both a chance to reconnect, to find the closure they both needed. The day of the meeting arrived, and Jane felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as she prepared to leave the cabin. She hadn't left her sanctuary since she first went into hiding, and the thought of venturing out into the world again, even for this, was daunting. But as she drove to the location David had provided, her anxiety was overshadowed by the anticipation of seeing the boy again. The drive was long, taking her through remote, winding roads, but finally she arrived at a small, secluded house, surrounded by trees. 2 members of the task force met her at the door, their expressions neutral but respectful. They escorted her inside, where she was led to a cozy living room. Jane's heart raced as she stood in the doorway, her eyes searching the room until they landed on the small figure sitting on the couch. The boy looked up as she entered, his eyes widening in recognition. He stood slowly, his expression a mix of uncertainty and hope. "Jane?" he asked, his voice small and tentative. Jane smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "It's me," she said softly, taking a step toward him. "I'm here." The boy hesitated for only a moment before he rushed forward, throwing his arms around her waist in a tight embrace. Jane knelt down, wrapping her arms around him and holding him close, her tears falling freely. For a long moment, they stayed like that, simply holding each other, the weight of everything they had been through finally lifting. Jane could feel the boy's small body trembling with emotion, and she held him tighter, reassuring him that everything would be okay. "I missed you," the boy whispered, his voice choked with tears. Jane's heart ached with love and sorrow. "I missed you too," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "So much." They sat down on the couch together, the boy leaning against her as she held him close. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jane felt a sense of peace, a peace that came from knowing that the boy was safe, that the truth was out, and that, despite everything, they had both survived. They talked for a while, the boy telling her about his new life, his new guardians, and how he was adjusting. Jane listened, her heart swelling with pride at how resilient and strong he was. He had been through so much, but he was still here, still fighting. As their time together drew to a close, Jane knew that she had to say goodbye again, but this time it was different. This time there was hope, a future that wasn't shrouded in fear and uncertainty. "Will I see you again?" the boy asked, his eyes searching hers. Jane smiled and brushing a tear from his cheek. "I hope so," she said honestly. "But no matter what, I'll always be with you, in here." She placed her hand over his heart, just as she had done before. The boy nodded, his eyes shining with understanding. "I'll remember," he said, echoing the words he had spoken during their last goodbye. Jane hugged him one last time, savoring the moment before she finally stood to leave. As she walked to the door, she turned back to see the boy watching her. a small smile on his face. It was a smile of hope, of triumph, of a future that was now possible. As Jane left the house and returned to her life of quiet anonymity, she felt a sense of closure, of redemption. She had fought for the truth, for the boy, and though the road had been long and difficult, it had been worth it. The world knew the truth, and she had found her peace. As the months passed, the aftermath of Jane's battle for the truth continued to ripple through society. The story she had uncovered had set off a chain reaction that led to sweeping changes in both public policy and public perception. The media had finally embraced the full scope of the scandal, and the pressure on those involved in Mr. Roberts' experiments was relentless. Several high-profile trials took place, with those responsible for the atrocities facing justice at last. The revelations about the experiments and the cover-up sparked widespread outrage, leading to new laws and regulations aimed at preventing anything like it from happening again. The public, once skeptical, now demanded accountability, and the institutions that had allowed such horrors to occur were forced to undergo drastic reforms. But even as the world moved on, Jane remained in the shadows. She had chosen her path, and while the truth had been revealed, she knew that her role in the story was far from over. There would always be those who sought to exploit or manipulate the boy, those who would stop at nothing to regain control of the narrative. Jane's decision to stay hidden, to protect herself and the boy from those who might do them harm, was reaffirmed with each new development. David kept in touch, providing updates on the progress of the trials and the ongoing investigations. His messages were often filled with a mix of triumph and caution. While they had won a significant victory, the battle for justice was never truly over. There were still powerful forces at play, still those who would try to rewrite history to suit their own ends. But despite the challenges, Jane found solace in knowing that the boy was safe. His new guardians were devoted to his well-being, and they kept her informed about his progress. He was adjusting well, attending school, making friends, and slowly beginning to heal from the trauma he had endured. Every update brought a smile to Jane's face, a reminder that her sacrifices had been worth it. One day, months after their last meeting, Jane received a package in the mail. It was unmarked, with no return address, but she recognized the handwriting on the label immediately. It was the boy's. Her heart skipped a beat as she carefully opened the package, wondering what he had sent her. Inside, she found a small, hand-drawn picture of a house surrounded by trees, with two figures standing in front of it. The figures were holding hands, and one of them was unmistakably Jane. Along with the drawing was a simple note, written in the boy's neat handwriting, "I remember." Tears filled Jane's eyes as she held the picture close. The boy had remembered their promise, remembered that she would always be with him, even if they were apart. It was a gesture of love, of gratitude, and it touched Jane deeply. She placed the picture on the mantel above her fireplace, where she could see it every day. It was a reminder of everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, and everything she had gained. The boy was thriving, and the truth was out. There was nothing more she could have asked for. As the seasons changed and the world slowly began to heal from the wounds of the scandal, Jane found a new sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do, and though her life would never be the same, she was content with the choices she had made. The world knew the truth. The boy was safe, and justice had been served. One evening, as Jane sat by the fire, lost in thought, she received a final message from David. "The last trial ended today. They're all behind bars. You did it, Jane. We did it." Jane smiled as she read the words, a sense of closure washing over her. It was over, truly over. The fight that had consumed her life for so long had finally come to an end, and she could now look forward to the future with a sense of hope. She responded simply, "Thank you, David, for everything." David's reply was just as succinct, "Thank you, Jane. The world owes you more than it can ever repay." As she put down her phone and looked around the cozy cabin that had become her sanctuary, Jane realized that she had found something she hadn't expected, a new beginning. The battle for the truth had defined her for so long, but now she was free to explore what lay beyond it. The world outside was still filled with challenges, still fraught with dangers, but Jane knew she had the strength to face them. She had fought for justice, for the boy, and for the truth, and she had won. And now she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The legacy of Jane's battle for the truth had a profound impact on the world. As the months turned into years, the events that had once seemed like a nightmare became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding those in authority accountable. The story of Mr. Roberts and his heinous experiments was taught in schools, discussed in universities, and analyzed in documentaries. It became a part of history, a dark chapter that the world vowed never to repeat. The reforms that followed the scandal were sweeping. Governments around the world implemented stricter regulations on scientific research, ensuring that ethics and human rights were at the forefront of any experimental endeavor. The organizations that had been complicit in Mr. Roberts' crimes were dismantled, and new oversight bodies were established to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. But beyond the legal and institutional changes, there was a shift in public consciousness. People became more aware of the potential for abuse of power, more vigilant in questioning authority, and more committed to protecting the vulnerable. The boy, who had once been a nameless victim in a twisted experiment, became a symbol of resilience and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the truth could prevail. For Jane, the lessons she had learned throughout her journey were deeply personal. She had discovered the strength within herself to stand up against seemingly insurmountable odds, to fight for justice even when it seemed like the whole world was against her. She had learned the value of persistence, of never giving up, even when the path was fraught with danger and uncertainty. But perhaps the most important lesson Jane had learned was the power of connection. Throughout her ordeal, it had been the connections she had formed, the bonds of trust, friendship, and love that had sustained her. From her collaboration with David to the unbreakable bond she had formed with the boy, these relationships had given her the courage to keep going, to keep fighting, even when the stakes were at their highest. As Jane reflected on everything that had happened, she realized that she had not only uncovered the truth about Mr. Roberts, but she had also uncovered the truth about herself. She was stronger, braver, and more resilient than she had ever imagined, and she knew that these qualities would carry her forward into whatever the future held. The boy, too, had grown in the years since the scandal had first come to light. With the support of his new guardians and the love that Jane had shown him, he had blossomed into a confident, compassionate young man. He carried with him the lessons of his past, but he was no longer defined by them. Instead, he was determined to use his experiences to help others, to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure what he had gone through. He and Jane stayed in touch, exchanging letters and messages, each update a reminder of the bond they shared. Though they were physically apart, their connection remained strong, a testament to the love and trust they had built together. The boy often spoke of his dreams for the future, of becoming a lawyer, an advocate for those who had no voice, just as Jane had been for him. Jane couldn't have been prouder. She knew that, in many ways, her journey was also the boy's journey, and that the lessons they had both learned would guide them for the rest of their lives. The world continued to change, to evolve, shaped in part by the revelations that Jane had fought so hard to bring to light. But amid all the chaos and uncertainty, there was a sense of hope, a belief that no matter how dark things might become, there would always be those willing to stand up for what was right. Jane found peace in that knowledge. She had done her part, played her role in the grand tapestry of history, and now it was time for her to live her life on her own terms. She had earned that much. One evening, as the sun set over the tranquil landscape that surrounded her cabin, Jane sat on the porch, her heart full of gratitude for the journey she had taken. She had fought for the truth, and in doing so, she had found herself. The world was a better place because of her efforts, and though her story had come to an end, the impact of her actions would be felt for generations to come. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Jane smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had done what she set out to do. She had made a difference, and in the end, that was all that mattered. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button.